today. So one of the first question is, rather than a feminist or a male-female perspective, shouldn't we first talk about a human perspective?
I've been asked a lot of times why I still continue to call the work that I've been involved in feminist-informed PAR. And I think because feminists have continued to raise questions about power, privilege, dignity for all humans, not just men or not just women. But humanism didn't always ask those same questions. So, and this is my perspective, others might feel different. So I'm comfortable continuing to talk about feminisms with an S because I think feminists have been instrumental in asking questions about how do we unsettle inequitable power relationships that are based on, that are multidimensional, that are intersectional. You know, feminism has moved way off only looking at gender. Feminism really looks at the intersectionality of power that comes from our multiple identities. And I don't think over time humanism as a philosophy has asked those same questions. So for me, that's why I continue to talk about feminist-informed PAR.
Well, I think that in our context, a lot of critique of poverty analysis, for example, has been that it has not taken a feminist lens. So we club together, we aggregate as opposed to desegregate, because the impact on the lives of women is substantially different, even if you are in the same class. And part of the reason it is difficult and has not been done so adequately is because discrimination is not just limited to public sphere, it sort of seamlessly crosses into the so-called private sphere. So inside the family, oppression and discrimination is very much a part of the lived experience. And so I think without keeping a feminist lens on it, we will never be able to unravel the specificity of experience, which is different.
I mean, for example, feminism not only looks at what does gender mean for women, it helps us look at, well, what does gender mean for men? And although there are ways that masculinity privileges men, it can also be hurtful to men. You know, men have and sometimes more of a narrow range of the human experience that's available to them. Where, I mean, certainly my generation and my daughter's generation, we have more of the full range of human experience open to us. And that's not always the case, I think, for young men still. That there are still many challenges that men face because of hypermasculinity. What's expected of them, what happens for them. So again, I think that's part of feminists, with an S, feminism's contribution is to help all people look at their multiple identities and how those impact their life opportunities, their life experience, what's available to them.
No, and I think human perspective is an ideal, and we say we should be looking at human perspective, but the fact of the matter is that when we say human beings, even today, we still mean largely men. So I think if you have to understand or reach the human perspective, you will have to put the lens of feminism on that in order to reach that. So we are not there right now. If we were there, then we would have the human perspective. We don't have to talk about feminism or masculinities as well. And part of the problem of the human perspective is, I feel that while men have advantages, there are certain disadvantages they do not want to acknowledge, because by giving up that disadvantage, they also feel they're giving up power in many ways. So I think this whole thing of human perspective is something we are aspiring towards in what we call a feminist perspective. So it's human perspective in a more holistic way. So So that's how I see it. Anyway, we should always be human and not male or female, but that's, like I said, an ideal world and it doesn't exist like that. Okay, now here's another. Feminism dictates modes of behavior and being as well, to a large extent. Does the participatory aspect address this? The feminine modes of behavior that are dictated.
Well, one of the most powerful aspects of participatory research is its validation for emotions as a modes of knowing. Otherwise, cognition, the mental apparatus of manipulation of concepts and symbols is what was seen as the dominant mode of knowledge production. I think the feminist mode of behavior is one of the inspirations, if not an attribution. I think it's more an inspiration, where emotion as a valid, legitimate means of knowing. If I'm feeling bored, the curriculum is not interesting. So feeling bored is data, and therefore it should be used in developing our understanding of reality. And the tools of participatory research, some of the methods that have been developed, actually, in my view, promote phenomenological and emotional, affective dimension of inquiry, which gives the research process an open and a wider lens than has been possible. That's one interpretation.
I'm wondering from a conversation I had during the break if part of this question is about the caution to feminists. If I could just see this for a minute. Feminist dictates modes of behavior. And I wonder if it's the caution to feminists not to try to say, here's the one way to be a woman. I don't know if that's where the question is coming from, but for me, part of feminists' goals, if you will, is to try to make the full range of human experience, human opportunities, human emotions available to both men and women. And not to say, okay, now that women's movements in a certain place have made these options available, you have to do X. But instead to say, well, now X is available to you. It wasn't before, but it's still your choice, given resources, because you really don't have equal choice if you don't have access to equal resources. But I don't know if that was part of the person's question of feminisms. Feminists have to be careful not to say, okay, now that we've collectively or regionally or whatever fought for certain opportunities, we've got to do this to be a woman in society.
But it is, to me, it's not a question of a feminist mode of behavior. There is no A or the feminist mode of behavior. Because acknowledging your emotions is not part of masculine socialization. So part of the male socialization has been, you don't cry, you don't say, oh, I'm failing, or I'm vulnerable, or all that. We're not supposed to say as men. We are always supposed to say we are winning, we are conquering, we are strong, we are much more. So I don't think there is the feminist mode of behavior, or a feminist mode of behavior. In participatory research, where its value comes in is when we acknowledge the impact of male socialization on our way of understanding reality. That's what you were saying earlier, that my lived-in experience, my masculinity in life. So what lens I am using that lens allows me not to see
Right.
is where the challenge is. So I think that the phrase feminist raises all kinds of imagery in people's head. And
I think, what you're saying is, when you talk of feminism, I think again it's a very narrow perspective of what women think, primarily being related only to women. But if you broaden the perspective, like you said, that feminism is talking about what human beings think. So you're addressing, so what do feminists do? They're looking at unequal relationships and they're saying how can we redistribute power and control to make them more equitable. So you're talking about both men and women. You focus on women because you're bringing the balance. You're bringing the balance to the fore as an issue. So feminism is not about women alone, but feminism is looking at human beings in a different way. So look at human beings as being more equal. The problem is when you think of feminism in this very narrow, radical, aggressive, the brow-burning kind of variety that you think about as feminism, I don't think that's a perspective one should look at it from. It's bringing in another dimension to what I think that was very important to this whole human perspective issue, and I like that perspective of talking about human beings as opposed to males and female or masculine and feminine. So I think the broader perspective would very much fit into that. Because no one is trying to superimpose, women or feminists are not superimposing their ideas on what is already existing. They're just talking about bringing about a balance in what already is there.
Women's ways of knowing are often patriarchal themselves. How does one use participatory research to question this patriarchy?
Yeah, I mean, whatever work that we're doing, any of us, that has to do with dignity, social justice, we do it because we come from that perspective. We're not neutral. I'm not neutral. I have a view in the world of what I believe justice is. I have a view in the world of what I think is fair, is right. So, I understand everyone's right to their perspective, but I'm not going to, in my own work, support racism. I'm not going to support injustice. I used to, the teachers that I worked with, I say, some would say, when they came from some of them, a very fundamental Christian perspective that had with it a certain view of how men and women should be in the world. And I said, you have a right to that perspective. That is your right to have that. However, as an educator, it's your responsibility to create a safe space for all your students. You know, whatever your perspective is on homosexuality or lesbianism or whatever it is, you can have that perspective. But you as an adult educator in the classroom have to create a safe space for all your students, even the ones you don't agree with. You have to create that safe space. So I don't know if that kind of speaks to your question of, there are things that, participatory research is a valued position. It's not neutral. It's a counter to the false neutrality of social science research. It's a counter to the false objectivity that the researcher has no perspective, the researcher has no values. The researcher always has values. The minute you ask your question, you've exposed your values. So it's not about, in a sense, pretending neutrality. It's about naming the values that you have. Now, what does that mean to working in communities? Yes, respecting people's rights to their views, whether it's religious or spiritual or whatever. At the same time, trying to create spaces that people can question inequity, assaults to human dignity. And why do this work if that's not what we're about? So there's always that tension between respecting what people in a community, their values, at the same time our work, participatory action research, comes out of a values base and work that we're trying to do in the world about human dignity.
Interesting, because I always feel that when you say women have patriarchal ways of thinking, that's the dominant norm. But I think participatory research is not saying this or that or the other. What you're actually trying to do is make people question their own situation and analyze the discrimination that exists, which they may not have seen before. They may have a patriarchal mindset, but that's okay. But if you analyze, critique, and understand that, then I think your whole, so if you look at patriarchal mindsets of women, they change once they begin to see the reality in a different way. And that's true for men as well. So when you're saying you're changing mindsets, you're asking human beings to critically analyze the position they're in, whether they are men in positions of power or women in positions of subordination. So it's women, it's tribals, to analyze, critique, and then what do you do to bring about change in your life which is positive. So everyone comes with their own mindsets, their own values. All of us in this room, we're not neutral. But a questioning will then make us understand the situation from a different perspective.
You know, this is a, if I may bring you back to the comment you made earlier. But this is a larger question of the future of participatory research. And where is the future? What's the future? You mentioned about youth and young people. But also you made an observation which I had not thought in those terms when you said that in the late 70s, early 80s, a number of participatory research networks were started. And today, in your assessment, PRIA is the only one which is surviving. What does it say about, why or why not? And then within that, maybe what the young practitioners or young participatory researchers should be doing. Because we have to, has participatory research run its course, so to speak? Or has it disappeared in the somewhere in the hidden in between spaces? What's your sense?
A lot of questions in there, as well as the original question I don't want to lose. I don't think participatory action research or feminist-informed research has run its course in the sense of that what it's about at base is speaking truth to power. That's really what it is at its base. And there are powerful powerful backlash, powerful resistance to speaking truth to power. There are, and so it may be periodically that action research, participatory action research kind of gets, first it gets sort of kind of pulled into the sort of traditional research. Once you have the World Bank talking about participatory action research, you're in trouble. And it's sort of like you're trying to figure out how to keep the radical edge at the same time you're trying to figure out, well, you want to keep the radical edge, but you've got to scale up enough to make difference. So there's that challenge. So I think sort of back to the question of what I would say is,
what's the advice?
Advice to those young practitioners for feminist and participatory approaches. I think you kind of do a couple of things at the same time. Read, read feminist scholarship, read participatory action research work, and something that I think is common to both of those ways of research is the whole notion of voice. Both these fields that are trying to somehow connect feminisms and participatory action research are constantly asking who benefits from what knowledge. And so I think, for young researchers and young people, or young action researchers in the field, you keep looking at who's at the table, who has a voice, who doesn't have a voice here. And regardless of what you call it, I think you can be a voice in a project You can be a voice in an organization. You can be a voice to say, well, you know, who didn't we hear from? Who else could we include? Whose knowledge could be helpful to us? And then I think you have to find mentors. You have to find people who support your work. Because whether it's participatory action, I mean, in PRIA, you feel like, okay, well, you've got an organization, that's what you're committed to. And you have, spin-offs, you have other organizations that share your philosophical grounding. But that's not always the case. A lot of this work is very lonely. You have to find mentors, you have to find allied voices who have some of the same values base that values multiple perspectives, that values multiple voice, that values sharing resources, that values asking hard questions. And sometimes, it's one other colleague, it's two other colleagues, it's supporting each other in that work.
I just looked at it from the flip side to say, rather than put the onus on young people, I would say, what about practitioners and pioneers like you and Rajesh, of perhaps doing something which hands over the baton, so to speak, to the younger generation? Because otherwise, I think Rajesh's question of have we come to the end of it or not? And I think maybe it's a critical moment to really look at participatory feminist approaches to participatory research. Because then if you're asking youngsters to reinvent the wheel all over again when there's still a gap left. So I think it could be a turning point now to actually go in that direction so that you're giving, that we're leaving youngsters a legacy that they can carry forward and build upon. So I don't see it, I don't see the onus on the younger generation, but I see an onus on the pioneers of this movement, and that's an issue that one can talk about. It will come, when we discuss the future of participatory research. Feminist perspective of participatory research. Such a perspective does lead to change in attitude and mindset, which may or may not lead to change in values. But such a perspective does change the behavior in such a way that everything is right only from feminist perspective, others are all wrong. Other views does this not cause a bias? Is the feminist perspective the only perspective and are all others wrong? So are we building in, and is there an inherent bias in the feminist perspective?
There's an inherent bias in every perspective.
That's true.
That's what any theory, any approach is a lens. There's always, again, I think we talked about this a little bit, the caution of saying, well, one way is the only way. And for myself, I don't think as a feminist, I fought for, here's one way of being in the world, and if you don't do this, you're wrong. I think instead it's fighting for that all humans would have full access to the full range of how to be a human in the universe, and not be limited by your identities, but that takes access to resources. And so it's also about fighting for greater fairness, to greater access to fair shake of resources. I think the point that you raise is valuable. You have to be careful that as a feminist or whatever your philosophical perspective, that you don't try to make it squashing and limiting
my sense is that when the field of participatory research was gathering initial momentum in the 80s, the dominant mode of analysis was based on class, economic relations. And as a result, other relations of power were subsumed. With the assertion of feminists and feminist literature and studies coming into play, that axis of discrimination and injustice came to the fore. In certain contexts, indigenous communities, your own work with Navajo, you work with Navajo communities and Navajo women as well. So we have in this culture, for example, the Dalits or scheduled caste and women in those communities. So you have a class, caste, and gender divide. So a more informed analysis of reality and a more informed approach to promoting voice, as you were saying, would keep the gender lens intact, even when you are using the caste or the class lens. And historically, the caste or class lens did not necessarily bring in the gender lens. It's only in recent years that has been integrated. So if in a particular setting we are undertaking participatory research with indigenous communities, we are not only looking at the discrimination and marginalization of indigenous community, but also women in indigenous community, what's happening to their experience, and how can that be brought to the table, as you said. So I think there are two issues about the word bias. One issue is your standpoint, where do you stand? And if you start by acknowledging that you stand for justice, some would call it bias. They are biased. And then your framework of analysis, which will, if it includes gender discrimination, gender injustice, then that's not bias, that's your framework of analysis. Somebody may come and say, no, for me, economic discrimination is, most important. Class analysis is more important. Well, that's okay, you do your class analysis, but within the class itself, then you have, because the gender discrimination is not limited to public sphere only. It's inside the family. It's the so-called private sphere, which has been ignored. So we have had, revolutionary Marxist leaders, trade union leaders, political leaders, giving fiery speeches on the factory gate and going home and beating up the wife. And that was, till very recently, in Marxist practice, was seen as a subordinate question to the larger question of class discrimination. I don't think we can perpetuate that any longer. So the bias is not bias is sometimes, it implies distortion. You're distorting understanding or distorting reality or whatever. I would discriminate between standpoint. If you stand for justice, you call it bias or not, but we stand for justice. And therefore, we would support the voice of all those who are currently not able to. So I would put it that way. Because these, otherwise people say, oh, you're biased. Of course I have a standpoint. I believe in justice. No question. That's up front. There's no negotiation on that. So, in my study, am I looking at injustices? Of course I am looking at injustices. And injustices would have class, caste, and gender dimension. And while the caste dimension may be important for some participatory researchers, I don't think it is possible to any longer to not pay attention to the gender dimension within the caste itself.
Because if you don't look at the gender dimension in caste, then that in itself is biased.
Yeah.
Because you left out the dimension, right?
If I could just piggyback on that one other way, there's always a caution for sort of outsiders to be careful about what they take inside, to be careful of that. But there's also, I think, sometimes outsiders, however you want to define that, outsiders sometimes can raise questions that insiders might like to, but because of their power position, they can't voice it. So there also is a role for outsiders to raise questions that might be seen as culturally insensitive or culturally inappropriate or not appropriate to a certain community, because you get to leave. But still, I think there sometimes is a role for an outsider to ask questions that people inside may like to ask, but they're just not in a position to ask it.
The future. So what changes would you make, if any, to the practice of PR as it has been practiced for the past 40 years? As a field of inquiry, does it need to be changed? So this is the same question that we were asking. Where is the the movement, or where is participatory action research heading? And are there any opportunities in that for pursuing gender justice?
I don't know if it's a change so much as just an expansion. That participatory research, I think, has a right to be very proud of the contributions that have been made over a period of time, to be a source of resistance and a source of speaking up, speaking out, acting out. So I think it's a tradition that participatory action researchers have some right to be proud of the work that's been done, and to say that we want to keep expanding that space for more voices isn't to denigrate the sense of the work, but just to understand there's always room for growth, improvement, for improving ourselves as people in this endeavor. I'll stop there.
I was intrigued by two recent sort of official developments. When in the 80s we would interact with the world of academia here, particularly in South Asia, they would dismiss participatory research as unscientific, all the usual, or some would say, oh, this is social work, this is not knowledge, etc. But lately, there are two very interesting developments which indicate that perhaps there is some pressure on sort of research institutions or researchers to embrace participatory research. One is this new scheme that has been launched in India. I was telling you about University Grants Commission on setting up centers for fostering social responsibility. And in the guidelines for the scheme, they're talking about use of participatory research methodology. And in this, our newly launched campaign on Swachh Bharat, elimination of open defecation, etc., they're talking about setting up research and learning units where participatory action research is being recommended. Now, in both ways, it could be an opportunity as well, but it could also be a way of, losing the, as you said, the radical edge, which is always a tension between piloting something and scaling it up. So I feel that in the larger democratic context that we are in, it will be increasingly more important to get missing voices to be heard. And those missing voices are not limited to the class or the caste alone. I think a big question in our society now is age. The young people versus the elderly. And the voice of the youth is trying to assert itself. Keeping the feminist perspective in the focus, I feel, liberates me to look at other forms of discrimination and justice as well. Because we have that experience more universal. The experience of masculinity and femininity, the socialization experience, if you keep that in your framework, then you would be able to use this more generally in this. So I see the possibility of some spaces opening up in higher education institutions here for learning and practice of participatory research. But ultimately, the real test of it is whether it gets applied in practice. Learning participatory research in the classroom is never going to be enough, and the classroom does not provide for what you said in the beginning: time or resources for relationship building, for facilitation. No research methodology course teaches you how to facilitate conversations, how to enable women to speak up, and that's where the contribution of adult education and learning theories come into play. So, while new opportunities for teaching participatory research in academic institutions may emerge, I think more support for practice will make the difference. Martha's challenge is to the pioneers, and maybe we need to think of ways by which we can support that in the context in which we find ourselves today. There was a time when we were busy building our centers and institutions, and maybe now we can support others to take it forward.
Amen. Any concluding remarks on that? Because I think that's the most interesting part of the evening. How are we going to take this forward?
I'd like to say for myself how re-energizing it is to have this conversation, to see so many of you who talk to people during the break that you're doing work that is participatory in your particular settings. I think PRIA has played all the people in PRIA have played such an important role worldwide in the work of participatory action research, and you're continuing that work. It's energizing, and it gives us all, as we leave here, work to do.
Thank you. So we come to the end of this conversation. I think it's been very stimulating, but it also holds a lot of promise for the future, especially from the pioneers of this movement. So we look forward to that, and look forward to interacting with you now and taking the whole process of participatory research forward. So thank you both, and thank you to the audience for all your wonderful questions. And may I invite you all for a cup of tea now?
Yes.